I think we're ready to start.
Hi.
Welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. Really appreciate your time. I know that everybody is probably zoomed out, but we've had such a great response to this evening's event, which is PIAC's Climate and Energy Forum, entitled Just Transition to a Sustainable World. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which I'm joining you from today, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I know that people are joining us from traditional land from all around Australia. And I pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I also extend respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are with us today. I'm Rebecca Huntley, and I've been really fortunate and very thankful to be asked to moderate our forum this evening. I've been a researcher for many, many years, but one of my most recent passions and particular interests is public attitudes to climate change. I wrote a book called How to Talk About Climate Change in a Way That Makes a Difference that was published earlier this year. And I'm just interested in not just public opinion about climate change, but how a whole lot of policy options and the political, technical and industrial ways forward for society to really deal with what has to be one of the most pressing issues that faces us as a community. So a few housekeeping announcements. So we've got lots and lots of participants joining us today. Like I said, from across Australia, please ensure that you're on mute. I think you've been muted by the host, unless you're called upon to ask a question during the Q&A session. I encourage you to turn your video off if you can and select the speaker view. That's going to make it a lot easier for you in relation to internet connection. This is high traffic evening. I think a whole lot of people under 14 are on fortnight, so it's actually going to be quite difficult for us to stay engaged. Turn your video off if you can. Particularly, we're going to be sharing a pre-recorded video message from the New South Wales Minister for the Environment, Matt Kean, shortly. Please open your chat session and post your questions on the chat. That's going to be, I'm going to be looking at that. All the staff from PIAC are going to be looking at it. We're going to try and get to as many questions as possible. We might see if we can aggregate some of them as we go along. The session is being recorded, but only for internal purposes. So there's a few very interested people who couldn't make it tonight. And if you're posting on social media, please use hashtag PIAC Talks and hashtag PIAC Just Transition. So a little bit of an event overview before I introduce our speakers. We know that we must achieve deep and urgent systemic change across our economy and society to prevent catastrophic climate change. It's not just been the recent, the fires of last season that have brought that home to us. Certainly as we head into the new fire season, that's something that is, that is clear to many of us who are concerned about climate change. New South Wales has acknowledged this by committing to a net zero emissions target by 2050. Today, we're here to talk about how we can make this energy transition in a way that promotes and protects social justice and human rights, something that PIAC has been really a leader in the community for championing those issues for a long time. So we're delighted to have with us on the panel today three fantastic speakers from who've got a long history in an interest in energy transition and climate change. The first is Simon Holmes. He's a director of the Smart Energy Council, a senior advisor to the Energy Transition Hub at Melbourne University, and he writes regularly about the transformation of Australia's energy sector. I've learned a lot just following Simon on Twitter. He's extremely good on that particular, sometimes very divisive, platform. And he spent more than a decade in precision farm water management and built the country's first community-owned wind farm, Hepburn Wind, near Daylesford in central Victoria. Welcome, Simon.
Thank you. Thanks, Rebecca.
There, Simon, I might get you to say hi.
Hi, everyone.
Coming all the way from lockdown Melbourne.
From lockdown Melbourne. Can't wait to join the land of the living.
Cool. And somebody else joining us from lockdown Melbourne, Donna Luckman. She's had over 20 years experience working for sustainability and environment organisations. She's the former CEO of Renew, a national organisation that advocates for people to live sustainably in their homes and communities. And she's currently the chair of the advisory panel for My Energy Marketplace. Welcome, Donna.
Thanks, Rebecca. And also one of my other hats is the Coalition of Community Energy, which is sprung up from the inspiration that Simon was a bit behind with getting Hepburn Wind up in the first place.
Yeah, fantastic community energy jumping, popping up all over the country, which is fantastic. And finally, Craig Memery. He leads the Energy and Water Consumers Advocacy Program at PIAC, and he's been in the energy sector since 2002. And he's managed demand and supply side energy projects of all different kinds and provided thought leadership on long-standing and emerging challenges for the sector. Welcome, Craig.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Hi, Craig. Great. So to kick off our forum, we're going to have a chance to hear from the Honourable Matt Kean. He's the New South Wales Minister for Energy and Environment. He's the member for Hornsby, and I don't think I'm the only one to be impressed about the Minister's advocacy and leadership around climate over the last 12 months and longer. I think he's been one of the most impressive Conservative voices talking about energy and climate that we've got. So we're very lucky to have him as a minister. And so he's sent us a really short but really interesting video, and I'm going to ask Anne from PIAC to share it with us now.
Today I'm speaking to you from the traditional lands of the Gringai people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to thank the Public Interest Advocacy Centre for the invitation to speak to this forum and give me the opportunity to thank you for the great work that you do. The New South Wales Government is proud to fund the Centre's Energy and Water Consumers Advocacy Program. We do it to help make sure that the needs of households are heard when it comes to energy and water reforms, regulation and markets, because we want to make sure all New South Wales households have access to affordable and sustainable energy and water services. Today's forum is about planning for a just transition to a sustainable world. It's a goal made more complex as we deal with the consequences of a global pandemic, which has upended so many aspects of our lives and delivered the biggest economic shock in peacetime since the 1930s. Protecting the vulnerable from the initial economic shock has been a priority. We acted early to help households struggling to pay their energy bills with a $30 million boost to the Emergency Support Energy Accounts Payment Assistance Scheme. The next and even bigger challenge will be how to rebound the economy from this deep recession to get New South Wales and the country back to work. A big part of that is building a low carbon economy, not just because it's good for the environment, but because it's good for the state and the country. And because the best way to build a healthy economy is to underpin it with cheap, abundant energy. The cheapest way of producing electricity today, it's not coal and it's not gas or nuclear. It's wind and solar, backed up by pumped hydro and batteries. And batteries are coming down the cost curve dramatically. Solar PV has evolved from being a high-cost specialist technology to landing on 1 in 4 roofs across Australia. It's basic fairness that low-income households get to benefit from the plummeting costs of solar panel power as well. That's why the government has introduced targeted programs to install solar panels on more than 5,000 social housing homes throughout regional New South Wales. Tenants in those properties are enjoying significant savings of up to $1,000 off their home energy bills. In addition, 689 Aboriginal housing office homes on the New South Wales mid-north coast and 272 Land and Housing Corporation's homes in the Riverina region will be upgraded with solar panels in the coming months. It's a big deal for those families and their household budgets. It supports regional jobs and it lowers carbon emissions. So everyone wins. For the same reasons, we are pushing ahead with the creation of reforms to promote the use of standalone power systems to supply energy in regional and remote communities. Usually a combination of solar PV batteries and a backup generation. These systems are fast becoming the cheapest and most reliable form of energy for some communities. One of the barriers to getting these systems up and running is outdated regulation. So we're cutting red tape and getting the regulation right to make it easier for New South Wales distribution networks and consumers to access these technologies. You can expect to see more action from us to help make this transition happen sooner and faster. We need renewables built at utility scale. And that's why this year I announced $110 million to develop the first coordinated renewable energy zone in the country. Renewable energy zones are modern day power stations and an efficient way to coordinate our natural energy resources. The biggest renewable utility scale project underway anywhere in the nation is Snowy 2.0. It will provide the deep storage needed to keep the electricity going when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. Right now, the Snowy Mountains region is a hive of jobs and growth. Towns are being revitalised and investment is flowing into the regions in levels not seen since the original Snowy Hydro scheme was built. Over the course of the project, Snowy 2.0 will create about 4,000 jobs over the life of its project and drive regional New South Wales out of this recession. I want to see that potential released right across New South Wales. There is so much more to be done to decarbonise our economy and supercharge our recovery. But I'm an optimist. I absolutely believe that we can lower bills for households and businesses and move to net zero emissions by 2050. I look forward to working with the Public Interest Advocacy Centre as we rebuild a greener and cleaner future for the better and brighter future for New South Wales.
Well, there's so much in that very short but punchy address from the Minister. The things that jumped out to me were things like that combination of social housing and renewable energy. This idea that we don't have to choose between recovering, that economic recovery from COVID and moving to a low carbon economy, that the two things can work together. The attention that he plays to Snowy 2.0, the idea of standalone systems being cheap and reliable, and this kind of concept of a renewable energy zone, and of course that focus on jobs. So I wanted to go first to you, Simon, because I've heard you speak, passionately and eloquently about the whole energy trilemma issue and how that whole issue around grid reliability, issues around regulation and incumbency, and just the kind of the role, just the optimism and ambition you have for renewable energy in Australia and New South Wales in particular, because that's where we're coming from at the moment. But I just wanted to get you to reflect on what the Minister had to say. I mean, when you listen to that, what's some of the things that jump into your mind?
Yeah, definitely that optimism that it's not a choice between recovery, COVID recovery, and doing the right thing by the environment. That actually they're very much aligned. You mentioned the energy trilemma. That was a phrase that I don't think many really heard before. I think around about 2016, 17, it entered into Australian political vernacular after the South Australian blackout, which was just 4 years ago. It was the end of September in 2016, and there was concerns that we wanted to make the grid reliable, power affordable, and low emissions, and it was set up as pick any two, but you can't have them all.
Yeah.
As we play forward, we're now at the point where, out of the Finkel review, which came as a result of that blackout, AEMO, the energy market operator, was tasked with doing an incredibly detailed study, and it's the most detailed study of any grid, I believe, anywhere in the world. That's what they've claimed. Over 100 person years went into the latest report for it, and tens of millions of dollars, and supercomputers, and the whole lot. And they've modelled the network through the transition, and they've shown that the least cost path forward takes us to heavy renewables. So our emissions come down, the cost of supplying the energy comes down, and most importantly, it keeps the lights on. So we have done the analysis that the trilemma is not only it's solvable, but it's the path we're already on. And what's great is I can see that Matt Kean absolutely understands that, and is facilitating the path of least cost to get there, rather than trying to push back against the tide.
And it's interesting thinking that, it was the South Australian blackout that put this kind of on the public agenda and made the public focus on it. 4 years later, from your perspective as somebody who has a deep understanding of energy policy, where do you think South Australia is? You know, how has it addressed some of those things that led to that blackout? It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, what's fascinating is we've had a change in government, but not a change in policy. In fact, it's probably, you know, possibly stepped up. We've got the Energy Minister is in South Australia, Dan van Holst Pelikan, is frequently saying that he intends for the state to get to 100% net generation, net renewables by the end of the decade, and probably before. So yeah, he's not resiling at all from the ambitious agenda that was set by the previous government. Things have moved a lot in South Australia since the blackout. I mean, the blackout was generally due to, I mean, there was 3 tornadoes ripped through the state, ripped down transmission networks, and set off a cascading set of failures that included a significant amount of human error. We've learned a lot from the human error and have adjusted a lot of the technical settings and procedures. But they've also added a whole lot of services to address security of the network there. So they've put in devices called synchronous converters, or condensers rather, I should say, and batteries, and changed their operations as well. So South Australia has a much stronger grid than it did 4 years ago. You could probably say that the energy market operator is gun shy and is taking an incredibly conservative approach there now. But yeah, no, South Australia, the prices are down to the same level as the rest of the country. The emissions are way down. They've halved their emissions from the energy sector there. The electricity sector, they've halved it in the last 8 years, and they're on track to halve it again in the next 8 years. So yeah, South Australia is or someone told me recently, if South Australia was a country, it would be the #1 country in the world for renewable penetration, well, for wind and solar penetration. So it's we've really got an example of how to do it right. But it started 4 years ago. That would have been an unpopular thing to say on the back of the blackout. But now if you take a look at it, they've nailed it and continue to do so.
Yeah, and look, the other thing, and I suppose before I move on to Craig to give us a bit more of a consumer advocacy perspective and to talk about the great work he's doing with PIAC, I think one of the interesting things too is when you look at particularly the development of regional jobs in South Australia and what renewable energy has been able to do in some parts of regional South Australia. It's interesting too to connect that as well with what the Minister had to say around a whole range of things like social renewable energy and these renewable energy zones, developing regional jobs. There's been more and more focus, political focus on the role that a low carbon economy, the transition to it might do in terms of developing jobs. Any reflections around that, about, how do we start to think about that job generating role that renewable energy can play?
So you made me think of an anecdote that I heard from South Australia. Had a commissioner for renewables. I remember talking to him about a decade ago. So up until very recently, South Australia, I think, be close to it now, has half the wind energy in Australia. That's shifting slightly, but for a relatively small population, about half the energy, half the wind. And on solar, Australia has the highest rooftop solar penetration in the world. South Australia has the highest in Australia by far. And last Sunday at midday, enough energy was coming from the rooftops from solar in South Australia to power the entire state. Like, they are well and truly ahead of everyone else. And I asked the commissioner, like, what were the things that made that happen? And he said, first thing he said was, he said, never get between a South Australian government and a development opportunity. That the state has always been focused on attracting development to the state. It's always felt like an underdog. And they understood early on that they could create a lot of jobs in areas where there weren't a lot of opportunities by encouraging developers. So the previous government, they did a fantastic job setting the vision, but they didn't actually put much money, if any, into renewables, but they had an environment where they attracted developers. They had a sort of one-stop shop within government to help developers work through all the red and green tape, and they were absolutely focused on creating economic opportunities for South Australia, such that half of the renewable energy target until recently was satisfied by South Australia. So is that kind of focus? And I think the modern equivalent of that are the renewable energy zones, where the state isn't putting significant money, well, they're putting no direct money into renewables, but they're looking at what are the barriers that would repel investors, or rather, what are what can be done to make an attractive environment for developers, and that's what the renewable energy zones that, again, New South Wales is probably leading. You know, it's fair a bunch of unresolved issues, and I'm sure we can have some interesting discussions around the renewable energy zones.
Yeah, I think Donna will have some interesting perspectives on that. But I'm going to go to Craig now. Listening to both the minister's comments and also Simon's response, I'm interested in your perspective in terms of the work you're doing with PIAC and your kind of history as a consumer advocate, from that consumer advocacy perspective that you've had since 2002.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks, Simon, for the opening comments. So PIAC's Energy and Water Consumer Advocacy Program was established over 20 years ago. I joined about 3-4 years ago, and most of the current members of the team did as well. And at that time, in 2017, we actually established an objective, which was that by 2025, average New South Wales energy bills would be 25% lower than they were in 2017-18 levels, while at the same time maintaining the level of reliability in the system that people want and progressively decarbonising the system. And if it sounds familiar, it's because that's basically the trilemma that Simon mentioned before. The work that we did around that time suggested that, yes, we could actually achieve all of those. We didn't need to choose just 2 out of 3. However, what we also identified was that we needed to make substantive changes to the regulations and the market to make that happen. We established a list of about 50 changes that we needed, but to pick up on one of them, or one theme that relates to how the minister's introductory points need to be introduced so that they really translate into decarbonising and making that transition at least cost in the fairest way. And one of them is rethinking the role of who provides energy for us, both for the regulated poles and wires businesses, but also the competitive businesses, retailers and generators. Because the system that we're moving into in the future is not the system that the current regulations and rules were designed for. And what we see with the small changes that have been made so far by the energy market institutions like the AMC, they're going in the right direction, but definitely not fast enough. To pick up on a couple of specific examples, so renewable energy zones have been identified as the most effective way to decarbonise while maintaining a reliable, still largely centralised energy system. There'll be a combination of solar and batteries and wind, and they'll require augmentation and new transmission infrastructure. So this is the big towers that you see with wires that carry electricity in large volumes around the country. The current rules, though, require that transmission infrastructure to only be built by incumbent transmission businesses. And so in New South Wales, we have an incumbent transmission business who has said that they won't be able to muster the investment required to build these new things. They're actually putting out their hand at the moment to seek a change to the rules so that they can be given a higher rate of return on that investment. Now, at the same time, there are global investors around the world who would be chomping at the bit to get the sort of returns that they can get on that sort of investment in the energy market. So we really need to open up that to contestability and investment from across the world to get the least cost. Another issue with renewable energy zones, they're important, we need them, but the current cost recovery arrangements are based on recovering all the cost of transmission from consumers. Now, people won't be the primary beneficiaries of renewable energy zones. They will benefit, but the primary beneficiaries will be the new generators that will be getting access to the market. So we need to, and we can, change the arrangements and the rules so that those generators can be given the opportunity and the obligation to contribute to building those new zones. They'll be beneficial for the generators because it means they get access to the market without constraints, and also it takes some of the cost away from consumers. And it is possible to make these substantive changes. Just in the last year, the Australian Energy Market Commission made a very positive announcement in response to a rule change request that was put forward by ourselves, the Australia Institute and Total Environment Centre, to introduce new competition into the wholesale market to allow for the Australian Energy Market Operator to pay large energy users to use a bit less energy at peak times as an alternative to switching on more expensive generators. This is called demand response, and it's a really important reform. And it's a really good example of how we can step away from just using incumbent businesses on the supply side for all of our needs in a way that helps to reduce costs for people, and we need to go in that direction.
I'm going to turn now, we're going to come back to Craig to talk a little bit about when we focus on just transition. There's some terrific questions coming through the chat, keep them coming. I want to turn to Donna Luckman. So Donna, you've got a particular interest in this concept about community energy. I want to get you to reflect, like I said, we're going to talk about just transition in a minute, but I want to get you to reflect a bit on what you call the kind of bottom top approach to energy policy. I have been seeing a lot more interest in this notion about community energy or community owned energy, and the Minister addressed a little bit of that in his comments, but I'd like you to expand on that.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. So the Coalition for Community Energy is the peak body for over 100 community energy groups across the country, and it just keeps on growing. And I think because they have come about because of all the problems within the system. So, you know, I think most people don't trust their actually energy retailer, and especially in regional communities, there's a real sense of the leaky bucket. They're sick of, like, you know, they're paying money out to big multinationals and the money actually doesn't come back to their communities. And they're seeing that across the country, and it's a real big concern. So a lot of reasons why people do get involved in community energy projects is because they do want to create those local economies, they do want to create those local jobs, but also they're taking practical action on climate change as well. So it can be quite hard and overwhelming for communities to go, what's the difference that we can actually make? So, you know, good examples of community energy projects is actually people taking the control and taking that power back. So they actually can generate their actually own supply, or they can support local communities at the same time as well.
Can you give us some examples? I mean, I was lucky enough a couple of weeks ago to launch independent MP Helen Haynes has done a kind of community power program and is going to, you know, is pushing that in the federal parliament. It was a terrific launch where there were community energy representatives from all over the country, different kinds of places in Australia, talking about the role that community energy can play in, you know, cheaper prices, climate action, underpinning small and medium business. Do you have an example? I know it's hard to choose out of all. It's like choosing between all your children, but something that you could really share with us, which really shows the power of how community energy can transform communities.
And I think also community energy comes in so many different shapes and sizes. So a lot of communities just start up by doing local bulk solar buys or rooftops, through to you know, what we have at Hepburn with the wind farm. But I suppose what to see to go to the next level is the project that we worked on with the Hepburn community, which is Hepburn ZNet, which is how we can actually make that whole shire zero net emissions by 2030. Wow. So this was a bottom-up looking at all the different emissions profiles, looking beyond energy, looking at transport, looking at land use, and looking at all the different ways within that community that needed to change to get to 2030. And I think what that was a really good example of was actually the buying from the community around that process as well. So to actually say to people, what's the different options that you wanted to do? We created about 30 things, mitigations that they could do in their communities to get to that target. and created like A0 little diagrams of what they can do and put them up in like town halls in all the 5 wards across the Shire. People will spend 1 or 2 hours looking at those different options, doing little sticky notes of things that they want to be involved with. And from that, we also had a community reference group who actually made the decisions about what's the next mitigations they wanted to do. So not only is it a good example about, how, we do the practical things, but it's actually the community engagement that is really important, and creating that social license as well for renewables and having the discussions around climate change too.
I mean, what's clear when you look at these community energy projects is that the opportunities and benefits are, are multiple for those communities. But what would you say are the existing barriers to get them really started, and those barriers might be regulatory, or they might be social, technological, whatever they might be. What do you think are some of the critical barriers to getting those off the ground?
For a lot of communities, it's actually just getting started and having their own resources to get community energy projects up. So we recommend, and what's in Helen Haynes' local power plan that you were at the launch of, was we actually need to develop community energy hubs around the country. And there was a trial in Victoria that was run with 3 different community energy hubs. And the return on investment on how they're able to actually get projects up and running by having those expert services there to help with the capacity building of those different communities, to help with actually the crossing of networking between the different projects ideas, that was able to really catalyse in those communities and come out with about 30 different projects within 2 years. Yeah. So that's what we really need to do to actually accelerate the community energy sector across the country. There's also some other ways that government can support community energy as well. So there's opportunities how they can actually, especially for those medium scale solar projects that a lot of communities are now looking at, how they can actually look at getting government support and discounts like through the VRET scheme that we have in Victoria, and other opportunities there to actually de-risk in some of the other areas to get those medium solar projects up and running.
Simon, I want to talk to you before we're going to head to question time soon. And like I said, keep those terrific questions coming in. I want to test something with you. I mean, you've been an outspoken business leader on climate action and renewables for a long time. You haven't necessarily always been entirely backed up by other members of the business community. But I feel that something's changing, something's shifting in the minds of financial institutions, investors, superannuation funds, corporates of all kinds outside the fossil fuel industry, even in some parts of the mining industry. I feel that over the last couple of years, something's moving. Is that wishful thinking? Do you think that?
No, I think it's backed up by plenty of data. If you look at the investment trends globally, it's shifting overwhelmingly to renewables and clean energy, and early indications from the automotive sector that the research and development arms of businesses have shifted almost entirely to electric. The teams that are working on internal combustion engines are shrinking. Look, I think a really significant thing happened. I'll take you. So I was doing a lot of advocacy in the community energy space back a decade ago, especially. We'd go up to Canberra a lot, and we would sit and meet with MPs, and we'd say to them, yes, look, renewables, they do cost more, but there's the environmental benefit, there's the jobs benefit, there's social benefits, and we can stack all of these things up. And we would build up a case to say it's still worth doing. Sometime around about 4 or 5 years ago, we didn't have to do any of that value stacking anymore. It just renewables became cheaper. And it took a couple of years before a lot of people in industry worked it out. But for the last 3 years or so, everybody knows that they're not going to build a new coal power station. And look, I think it's really significant. Current government is so disappointing in many ways on energy policy. But one thing that many people have missed is they've given up this narrative that we're going to build new coal power stations in Australia. 3 years ago, they were talking about heli coal, low emissions coal, clean coal. They've dropped that completely. Yeah. And everybody has now recognised that we now all agree on where we're going. It's just a question of speed.
Yeah. Now, Craig, when you hear the term, you know, just transition, what's some of the things that spring to mind for you, in particular in relation to things like risk and cost and how it differs across different kinds of stakeholders?
Thanks. So one of the issues relates back to what I mentioned before about how we pay for and who we pay for the supply side. And our view is that we need to move towards a beneficiary pays framework, and a framework where the costs are carried, where the risks are carried by those best placed to manage them. But if I could come to the sort of demand side and for consumers and what this means in terms of how we can get the best out of the opportunity for people to participate in the energy system with respect to decarbonisation and affordability. Most of the energy uses that people have fall into either the category of being essential or being flexible. Essential uses, they're your fridge and your lights. You can't really compromise them. You need them when you need them. Flexible uses for a lot of people might be their air conditioners, at least up until day 3 or 4 of a heat wave when they become a bit less flexible. Households who are getting batteries and electric vehicles can be flexible loads. Things like hot water, electric hot water. And the way that the market has evolved is completely backwards, because we have a whole lot of different providers, being 20 or 30 different retailers most people have to choose from, for providing those essential services where there's little discretion in how they can be used. It's the same electrons being used in the same way. And all we see is a bunch of different providers that were for a long time propped up by a deregulated market that allowed them to take advantage of people being disengaged by charging some people too much. Now regulation has been introduced and it sort of calls into question whether that market can be sustained at the size that it is. Meanwhile, over here, we've got a lot of the flexible potential energy uses that are untapped. So what we really need to do, and this has started to be achieved through things like introducing the demand response mechanism, at least for large users, but there's a lot more to do for households. We need to be able to allow people to do the flexible use of energy, to engage with the market, and to do that in a way that is tied up with the services that they want. Most people don't want to spend 24 hours a day looking at an app on their phone, waiting to press a button when energy prices in the wholesale market all of a sudden go high. But most people who want electric vehicles would like someone else to manage that charging for them and take responsibility for that flexibility. And the current regulatory arrangements don't allow that, because they only allow energy retailers to be the intermediary with the market. So to bring it back to the personal story, for people who want to actually participate in individually, and also this relates to community energy as well, there are lots of opportunities if we remove those barriers and if we bring about the opportunity for those new participants. And the benefit for people is that they get to participate flexibly in a way that maximises the benefit in keeping their bills down, but allows them to make a contribution to decarbonisation. Flexible load is a really important contributor to decarbonisation because it helps us to be able to fill the gaps where you do get lulls in output from renewable generation.
We're going to move to question time in a minute. There have been lots of questions put out and Simon's answered quite a lot of them. so I don't know whether I'm going to get him to answer them for the rest of the team, for everybody else to hear. But before I get to questions, I wanted to ask all three of you just quickly to reflect on a moment where, you know, so my work is not in energy policy. My job for a long time has been trying to understand community sentiment. My ex-partner used to say that I am an expert in the views of people that don't know what they're talking about. But as we know, that the views of the community, particularly on such a vexed issue like climate change and renewable energy, are actually pretty important to know if we're going to make sure that we're not just making a transition, we're actually making the transition that we need to make something that can happen politically at every level. And we've seen some really fantastic Conservative leadership on renewables at the state level, at the very least. So I wanted to ask all three of you, when you in your jobs, various jobs, trying to convince people about the importance of this rapid transition to a low energy economy, what are some of the principles you keep in mind about how to effectively convince people who are already not 100% convinced? And I'm going to go to you, Donna, like particularly with the work that you do in different kinds of communities. Well, obviously there's very different approaches to how people feel about the science of climate change and the urgency of action.
Yeah, and communities are different, as we all know. People are coming from different places and in different times. So there's not like, here's the one message and everyone go out and let's do that and we've solved all the problems. Like, you actually have the messages to what the community is actually doing. And I think what's really important is a lot about, for me, is peer-to-peer communication as well.
Yes.
So sometimes it might not be best for experts like ourselves flying from Melbourne or Sydney, going to a small regional community and saying, hey, this is how everything works. Yeah. It's actually the local community getting together, discussing what's their aspirations, what do they actually want for their community in a long year's time. And that's where you start getting that common understanding. And it usually is about down to the things about, we all want to have, we all want to have shelter and homes overhead. We all want to have jobs. We want to have, happy and healthy family and friends. And that's the common ground that you can start having some of these discussions, then going to the next stage. Well, how do we actually do that in the framework of oncoming climate change and the impacts of that? And what's the opportunities in our local communities that we can actually do as well? So I think there's been some really good examples. The Next Economy up in Queensland are doing some really good work in communities in central Queensland there. And I know from my own experience, when I was at Renew and we brought on board Sustainable House Day, which is a national event, we had about 250 people opening up their homes around the country. And these are just people in your street opening up their houses. You can go in and see what they've done from a sustainability perspective. And that is so much more powerful than come along and hear an architect talk for an hour about what you can do in your own home. You can see it, you can feel it, and you can talk to the homeowners. We usually tell them what didn't work, like give the warts and all, and it's from that learning that you can actually do. So I think it's that real thing about sitting down and understand what the community aspirations are, and really having that peer-to-peer learnings is really important.
Great. Just quickly, because I do want to get to questions. Craig and Simon, do you have anything to add to that, to what Donna said in terms of how you approach talking about these issues with people who are not already on board?
I'll start?
Yeah, you go first, Chris.
Sure. So firstly, I try to show people, I'm not actually trying to change people's minds anymore. This transition is already happening, and it's happening faster than anyone thought it would happen a few years ago, and it's just going to accelerate from here. So first thing is, I think we've moved past the point of asking. It's like 10 years ago. It's hard to remember, but very few of us. Let's say 15 years ago, very few of us had digital cameras. Almost nobody. Right? We'd take our films down to get them processed at the local shopping centre at the 1 hour photo place, and then 3 years later, everyone almost had a digital camera, and you couldn't get I don't even know if you can get film processed anymore, right?
It's very hard.
That transition happened, and for most of us, it was a positive transition. For most of us, we hardly even noticed. It didn't change our life, but we ended up with a better camera, more convenient, cheaper, but clearly, there were people who ran those 1 hour photo booths, and it left them behind, and it would have been dislocating for them to suddenly, over 2 or 3 years, their business model just disappeared. There was no government adjustment package for 1 hour photo booth.
No job keeper, no job seeker.
None of that at all. So we focus on this issue a lot in Australia about just transition. And look, that's just a decision that we need to make as a society. Do we help people transition out of industries that are dying? I fully support us doing so. And the good thing about it is it's actually a very small number of people relative to our economy. There are people, Qantas probably laid off 3 times as many people as in the last 6 months as the coal industry will lay off over the next 20 years. So it's actually not a big problem to solve. If we want to, as a society, solve it, If we want to make the transition soft landing and just transition, let's just do it. It's not hard, but it is inevitable.
To some extent, you've addressed Bronwyn's question in relation to this, which is what's needed to provide a just transition for these people. And I always think it's kind of interesting to see what happened in Germany, or what happens in any industry where the industry kind of collapses, and, you know, a certain percentage of people will never work in that industry again, and it's about making sure that they're either supported through the social safety net or retrained. Other people will go off to do something different, and then other people will retire. So, I mean, depending on where people are in that industry and their skills.
It'll be much less of a dislocation than the end of the car industry in South Australia. And we didn't do much at all, if anything, for them. But that transition was a large number of jobs over a very short period. The coal sector is a smaller number of jobs will be lost over a 10 to 20 year period.
Yeah. So I think we might move to questions, because I do have to end on time. Now, there've been lots of really interesting questions. Like I said, Simon's addressed a lot of them, although David, the lovely David, is not necessarily sure all of his answers have been sufficient. But there has been some really interesting questions and comments coming all the way through. I think there's been a quite good one from Paul in relation to, and it might be addressed best by Donna, Paul Kidd, who said, is the primary purpose of community energy hubs to be a substantial part of the energy system, or as a social and economic benefit to local communities, or both? So we saw some things in the Minister's comment about that idea about renewable energy and social housing, what that's doing in Indigenous communities and remote communities. I might get you to address Paul's question there.
And I think, once again, it's not an either or. So it's actually all part of the mix of the transition that we have to do. And I think just coming back to what you're saying, the Minister's energy efficiency is such a great example of that. Like, you know, if we're going to create green stimulus, energy efficiency is the powerhouse of jobs, of what we should be doing. And looking at ways that we can actually increase the comfort of people's homes, can we actually make them healthier places for people to actually live? It's a no-brainer where, one, it will create jobs, but also it will create better homes for other people as well. So, well, a lot with the community energy, yes, there is the social benefits, health benefits, and it's creating some generation in those towns as well. But I think what also community energy did, and what we did with Hepburn ZNet, was actually put that justice lens over it. We worked with the New South Wales University Practical Justice Centre, and when there was decision making by the local community about where they should be spending their money that they've generated from their different community energy projects, they actually applied justice to their decision making. So rather than probably doing something like putting on a new community energy system on a school, which would have made more generation, they actually decided to subsidise energy efficiency retrofits for low income households. So it's actually creating that benefit at the end of the day as well.
Yeah. There's been quite a few questions around carbon capture and storage. Callie asked about whether the world can achieve net zero without it, and there was a bit of an interaction between Simon and David about that. I wanted to get all the panel's reflection on carbon capture and storage. Can the states go it alone on renewable energy? Do incentives to companies to encourage battery storage on site make more sense than upgrading the transmission networks? Craig, I don't know, and Simon, anyone, really?
Maybe I'll jump in. So on things like carbon capture and storage, other ideas that could be considered far from commercial at this stage and have a lot of barriers to becoming commercial, like nuclear energy, like putting hydrogen into gas networks to be used by households. When we think about these options, it's important to think about who the intended beneficiaries are. And the intended beneficiaries of carbon capture and storage, they're not the environment and they're not the community. They're the businesses that face an existential threat from the move to decarbonisation. So in the case of CCS, that's coal businesses, for example. Now, as Simon's mentioned, there are other types of carbon capture and storage that are quite sustainable, like that used in cement manufacture potentially. So you wouldn't want to lump them all into that one category. Similarly, with putting hydrogen into gas networks, it's disastrously expensive and people are moving away from using gas to electricity anyway. So it would be a potentially a short-term thing that would result in stranded assets. That's not being done as a benefit for people. That's being done so that the businesses that, or it's being looked at so that the businesses that own gas networks don't go out of business so quickly. So we need to come back to who the energy system is for. There's a thing called the National Electricity Objective, which is actually the single part of the law of, in energy which is bound, which all of the rules that are made by the National Energy Market institutions have to comply with. And that law, that objective, puts the long-term interest of consumers as paramount. Not the interest of businesses, not the interest of existing incumbent businesses or investors. And there's been a focus in recent years on consumer preferences. And when we speak to people, I would prefer to call them people rather than consumers, but let's go with the nomenclature. Consumer preferences, overwhelmingly, people want to decarbonise the system. They don't want to kick the can down the road and see if we can throw a bit more money out of getting a few more years out of a coal-fired power station with carbon capture and storage. They want to move on to the next thing, batteries and renewables, and they want to actually see that transition being made. So I think it's an important point to come back to, that it's not in the public interest, it's not in people's interest, and it's not in consumers' interest to keep trying to flog the dead horse of fossil fuel.
Mm-hmm. Simon, any reflections on carbon capture and storage, and you as well, Donna?
Yeah, so I've studied carbon capture and storage quite a lot, and I'll just quickly say that it's a large basket of technologies. There's multiple different capture technologies and multiple different storage technologies, and it can be applied to a whole range of industries. Firstly, carbon capture and storage on coal is very expensive, and coal is already struggling to survive in the current market. There are only 2 demonstration plants in the world, and they're tiny. One of them shut down recently because it was uneconomic, so it's only one operating plant, and it's to put it in context, it's about 1/20th the size of the Eraring power station in New South Wales. So it's don't worry about carbon capture and storage on coal. It's simply not going to happen. It's in that sense, it's a sort of marketing fig leaf to like say, quote, clean coal, or it's just sitting out there as a bit of a distraction. But there is some promise for the technology, and I visited a cement plant in Belgium last year using Australian technology that can capture all of the CO2 from a critical part of the cement making process that lets off a lot of CO2, can capture that and put it underground. And so and the capture in that process is free. Just putting it underground costs a bit. So there is a pathway to decarbonising cement, and cement's something like 5 to 7% of our global emissions. There's a pathway for it. One of the important things with carbon capture and storage is it'll never be chosen unless there's a carbon price or a regulation on capping carbon for a certain industry. So anyone who pushes for it, it's not going to work on coal. Yes, it could be useful in some other sectors. But I mean, even a cement example, maybe someone will come up with a cement alternative, new cement 2.0 that has a whole different chemical pathway that's cheaper to make than current cement without the need for carbon capture and storage. Carbon capture and storage is not inherently evil or bad, but it's certainly been used as a smokescreen to cover up the inevitable decline of the coal sector.
Yeah. Before I go, there's a final question from Oliver before we end, but there's been some, David's been a regular contributor to the chat, and he's made a really interesting point here, which is research by Craig and my former employer concludes that consumers want in order affordable, easy to use or reliable energy and clean. And that's certainly true. If we're talking about trifectas, that's certainly what consumers want. There's no doubt about that. There's an interesting question from Oliver who wanted a kind of quick response from anybody in the panel about this. And he says, I've seen talk about DC being a potentially better way to transmit electricity over long distances. Any quick thoughts about this? And can somebody tell me what, DC is? I know it's a comic, and I know there's Marvel and DC, but that's it. See, I told you I wasn't an energy policy person.
So you know the band AC/DC? They were
Yes.
named after electricity, and you've got a choice between the two.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
So look, DC is used.
So the half of the band.
DC is
Right,
used in
okay.
small appliances, batteries. It has a narrow application.
Oh, I understand.
In energy transmission, it's actually used in undersea cables,
Mhm.
and it has merit there. In some cases, it's used over land, but there are a lot of barriers to it. It has benefits, but there are a lot of costs, and it's quite limited in its application. It's more effective when you have 2 points that are a long way away and nothing in between that you need to connect to, and that doesn't describe much of the energy market. So,
Yeah.
yep, DC has a use in undersea cables primarily, and
Okay.
you won't see much of it on land.
Except very, very long distance, right? There's China has put in some a lot of it recently from the northwest down to the east coast to move gigawatts of energy. But yeah, it's very expensive to tap into on the way. It's generally considered not viable to tap into it. So it's just for moving large amounts of energy from one side of a continent to the other. If we ever have an interconnector with Western Australia, it would be HVDC. But yeah, you won't see it going between regional centres in Australia.
Yeah, great. And yes, thanks, Paul Kidd. Direct current. I finally got there. That's good. It's good to learn. It's good to learn something at 7:30 on a Wednesday night on Zoom. It's always a benefit. I think we're going to wrap up our Q&A now. Thank you so much for everybody that's not only contributed questions, but also thrown out some comments and addressed other questions in that chat. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us for today's forum. We really appreciate your interest and support for this really critically important topic. And thanks to our panel speakers, Donna Luckman, Simon Holmes, Craig Memery, and to the New South Wales Minister, Matt Kean, for sharing his very thoughtful video address. Just quiet little fairy claps for our panel speakers. I'd now like to hand over to PIAC CEO, Jonathan.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. Look, for those still on the call, if you haven't read Rebecca's book, can I really recommend it to you? How to Talk About Climate Change in a Way That Makes a Difference. It's a really beautiful book, Rebecca. It's obviously really interesting and informative. One of the things that I love about it is that you talk very personally about the sort of the dread and the fear and the anxiety that it causes. And it's been really wonderful here tonight, that a real sense of hope. And you talk about hope in your book. And you say, the best kind of hope for the climate change era means accepting the stark reality of what climate change has done and will do to our planet. It requires a certain comfort with uncertain outcomes. It requires a bloody-minded attitude to moving forward regardless. And more than anything, it requires a belief in the power of the collective or groups working together to get things done. So we're really, really grateful to you for hosting tonight's session. We want to work in that collective with people like everyone who's been part of this call tonight. And so I really appreciate that sentiment. Thank you to you, Rebecca. Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Craig. I feel like before we all became epidemiologists, we were all experts in climate policy. So it's nice to have some actual experts in the room who can really sort out the fact from the fiction and share a really positive, forward-looking piece on what we're going to do, because the change is coming. Can I also just thank behind the scenes Anne Sloan, Thomas Shayu and Anna Livesey, who have put this together. It's been a fantastically interesting conversation. And just thanks finally to everyone for joining us. Please stay in touch. Go to our website to sign up for our e-bulletin at www.piac.asn.au. And we hope to see you again soon. Thanks very much and good night.